All right. All right. So we are here with Mark Wilkerson, author of Hollywood Dream, the Thunderclap Newman Story. Mark, good to see you today.
Yeah, you too, Paul.
So we are both very passionate fans of Thunderclap Newman. And so I just want to know, just to start off, how did you first get interested in the band, and what was the sort of process of wanting to do a book about their career?
Yeah, I definitely so my number one musical hero, I guess is the right word, is Pete. It's Pete Townsend. Um Really got into the I grew up in England, and I really got into the Who during the mod revival in the late 70s, and really especially got into Quadrophenia late 70s early 80s, which was right when I was becoming a teenager. And it's of course about this like adolescent teen going through a lot of stuff. And at that same point, 1984, I moved to the States from England, and I really kind of clung to that whole Englishness and the music that I'd heard during the mod revival. The Jam and the Who were the two big ones. But anyway, I definitely latched on to Pete and his lyrics. And when I got into writing several years down the road, the first thing I wanted to learn more about and eventually write about was Pete. So I did a biography of him that initially was self-published, and then a full, a conventionally published one in 2008 that came out on Omnibus Press. And it's kind of funny, like I really enjoyed the process of learning about something I cared so much about. And it's a 600 and some page book, but and that was published in 2008. But it was like when I was done, I was like, I never really stopped. I never stopped doing interviews and learning more. And one of the interviews I did in 2009, in the summer 2009, was with Andy Newman. And I had nothing. I was like, maybe one day down the road, I'll do an update to the book, which is ridiculous. It was a 600-page book that was a year, not even a year old at that point.
Hmm.
But I did this interview with Andy Newman, and as you learn about Andy, you don't forget having a conversation with him. He was a very warm and open, an interesting guy, and he was just fascinating to talk to. And he was so sweet and kind, and really interested in the questions that I had. And then he found out I live in Louisville, and he starts talking about Muhammad Ali, and then he talks about this 1920s American jazz artist named Bix Beiderbecke, who recorded some stuff over in Indianapolis, or in Indiana, just across the river. And the train came by, and they'd have to stop when the train went. He has all these just incredible details of so many different subjects. But anyway, so I never forgot that interview, and it was about 90 minutes. And then he sent me a letter, and he sent me a recording of a program about Pete and the influence of classical music on Pete's writing, that was on BBC Radio 4. He sent that to me. Just a really warm and engaging guy that was just really passionate and knowledgeable, and I never forgot it. Did a couple of other interviews. The update never happened. I wound up doing a couple of other books, and kids and family and job and all the other stuff. Fast forward to the pandemic, and I had I had thought about doing something about Thunderclap Newman or Track Records. Um, Sent a couple of proposals out. I thought about maybe a 33 and a third book about Hollywood Dream. They didn't bite. Um, and I remember pitching to Pete maybe a book about Track Records, the Who's record label. Um, and that wasn't a real pleasant experience for Pete financially. Um, so he wasn't really interested in that. And then I thought about the Andy Newman interview that had been sitting there unused, basically, and a couple of others. I did one with Roger Spear and Arthur Brown that was the same thing. They didn't get used for anything really. And I thought, man, if I do a book about Thunderclap Newman, which is a really fascinating, not only the musical side of it, but the personalities that are involved, and just the odd story of how it came together, very unlikely. I thought, well, I could use that Andy interview. Um, I could weave it all together, and also track records is a integral part of the story too. So I could also talk about that. And I kind of tentatively proposed that to Pete, and was really blown away by how fond he remains of that period with Thunderclap Newman. So that's how it came to be. And at that point, you know, I had this interview with Andy, who had passed away back in 2016, and I'm so glad I was able to speak with him. And I know you did an interview with him too back in the day,
Yeah.
but I didn't know what other, and I had Pete on board too, which was just incredible. And not just Pete on board, but a very enthusiastic and you know, engaged Pete as far as the subject matter and stuff. But I didn't know what else was out there. Um, and I was so fortunate to be able to just, first of all, you know, meet people like you that were already so deep into, you know, certain aspects of the story. And then Speedy's daughter, Trish, and Jim Avery, who played bass for the band, and then Chris Thomas, the producer, the like legendary producer, who actually has like a was there for like a critical little piece of this story. This had this amazing story that serves as like the opener to the book. So the access that I kind of in a way stumbled into in some places really makes it. You know, it was a fascinating story, but I was able to get these just amazing anecdotes from people that were there, which brought it all to life. So that's a long answer to that question.
Did you come across any unexpected challenges while writing the book?
I think, well, I guess the pandemic really didn't pose a challenge. Actually, the pandemic really posed more of an opportunity because, you know, there was a lot of things all of a sudden that you couldn't do. So I was like, man, I got a little bit more time to get into something. No, I think this was the least challenging project. I mean, I worked really hard at it, obviously, and I hope. Well, I was going to say I hope it shows, but hopefully you just don't notice because you know it shouldn't that shouldn't come into it. But it was an absolute joy to research and write just because of all these stories that I'd kind of, you know, when I was talking to so many people, and I was like, you know, they'd start recounting a story, and I'd be like, oh, this is amazing. An example: Richard Barnes, Pete's art school roommate and longtime friend, who came up with the name The Who, wrote Maximum R&B, which was my favorite book as a well, it's probably still is. But and I've read it so many times the binding fell apart, and I stuck all the pictures all over, you know, the pages all over the walls of my room when I was a teenager. But he told me about so Speedy Keen, the guy that wrote Something in the Air and was the, you know, the creative force in a way of Thunderclap Newman. He drove a truck delivering sand at one point, and because he was Pete's driver for, you know, a pretty long time. And Richard Barnes said he's walking down the road in Ealing, and all of a sudden he hears, "Hey, Barney!" And it's Speedy yelling out the window of his cab, and he pulls over. And Richard Barnes says Speedy gets out, and he's wearing, he goes, God knows what the other truck driver said to him, because he said he's basically wearing a tablecloth. He's dressed like a hippie. And he said this was like 1967, 68. And he said Speedy gets out, he parks, pulls over the side of the road, sits on a bench with Barney, and he starts singing him this song that he just wrote. And it's Something in the Air. I mean, stuff like that is just fantastic. Just a visual of things like that, you know, Speedy's personality in the creation of a song and all that. So I would say the only obstacles that I can think of is really digging up the written accounts of Thunderclap Newman from back in the day. There's some really good online resources, as you well know, that have some copies of Melody Maker, NME, Record Mirror, those, but they're not complete. Nowhere are they complete. So I had to go, I'd have to go digging around. I went to the library up in Cincinnati, where they have them on microfilm, certain years and copies. And then I spent a couple of days up in Chicago at the library doing the same thing, going through microfilm. And that's pretty, even if you're really into it, it's pretty tedious, all day just going through that stuff. And, it's hard on the eyes, and just when you're scanning a certain time period and you're just looking for anything that kind of, you don't necessarily, there were certain articles that I was looking for that I knew about and I didn't have copies of, but there was other stuff I just wanted to kind of just see what else was going on at that time. So yeah, I visited libraries. I went to the New York Library, and got some stuff there. And also, when I was in London, I went to the British Library, where they probably have the most complete collection, and it's all bound. They have physical editions, but you can't make copies of it or take pictures of it. You can just like write down what you see. So that was probably the most challenging piece of it.
And then, so most people only know Thunderclap Newman for Something in the Air, but there's so much more than just that one song. I mean, Hollywood Dream is personally my favorite album of all time. And a lot of people don't know that the band lasted until mid 1971. So talk a little bit about the band from 1970 to their breakup, because that's a period that not many people know about.
Yeah, because they Something in the Air, the single, which I thought was another just really crazy fact to contemplate. Track Records, the Who's record label, released the Who albums for a period of time there, and they had Arthur Brown, they had Jimi Hendrix, and Thunderclap Newman, and I think it was May 23rd, 1969, they released the same Thunderclap Newman's debut single, Something in the Air. The same exact day, Tommy, the Who's album, was released in the UK on the same label. So as soon as Tommy is released, Pete and the Who are gone to the States, and they're doing, they're touring, they're promoting. That was the year of Woodstock. Actually, today is the anniversary of their performance in Woodstock. So Pete was gone, and it turned out that wasn't a good thing, because he was the disciplinarian, and he was the guy that kept them all together and provided them with direction. So the single rockets up to number one, and it's a band that kind of floundered. It seemed like there was a leadership void. So by August of '69, they were pulled off the road to focus on the album. We get into '70, and for some reason, so Something in the Air came out in May, goes to the top of the charts, end of June, beginning of July, I think it was.
Nobody expected it to go to number one. Nobody.
Right. It caught everybody by surprise, and there was no follow-up. There's no, like, so many months go by, more than a year goes by, with no follow-up. So Thunderclap Newman's pulled off the road. They're focusing on studio work, but it's patchy. It's in between Who activity. It seems like the majority of the studio work really got done in February, March of '70, in Pete's house, in a little tiny room in Pete's house, with him playing the bass. But then when the album was completed and mixed, which I think was around July of '70, Speedy goes over to Italy, where he had some connections in the past, and he bumps into a couple of guys from an Australian band, Ronnie Peel and Roger Felice, and he's like, hey, if you guys, he starts wanting to put Thunderclap back together. At that point, Thunderclap was just the three core guys, Jimmy McCulloch, Speedy Keen, and Andy Newman. They needed a bassist and a drummer, and they recruited those guys. So get into towards the October, November of '70, the album comes out, and we've got a 5-piece Thunderclap ready to go, and they start cranking up the activity again. But yeah, the 1970 was the majority of the recordings for the album. I don't know if they performed any live dates that year at all. I don't think they did, but maybe at the very end of 70. But then they cranked back into action at the beginning of 71 with a pretty good chunk of live dates, you know,
Yeah.
playing in the UK. They did, Pete and the Who were doing these kind of workshops of the songs for Lifehouse, which is, you know, the some of the bits from Lifehouse became Who's Next. And Andy and the guys, Thunderclap Newman, actually performed, I think it was twice at those workshops at the Young Vic, because it turns out that the main character in Lifehouse is based on Andy Newman. So they did that. They did some shows around the UK. They wound up going on tour, doing the show in the Netherlands with Leon Russell. And then they go on tour with Deep Purple, which just seems like a really odd combination. They do like a Scandinavian tour with Deep Purple. And they may have done a couple of shows after that, 71, but then it just kind of seemed to, you know, I think Andy told, I don't know if he told you or me, I can't remember, but he just said it just seemed to, just like, there wasn't like an official Thunderclap Newman is broken up. It was just like, it just kind of
Fizzled out a little bit.
Yeah.
And if I remember correctly, the follow-up single to Something in There was Accidents. And I remember that the ad for it, quote, the rush up single to Something in the Air. And that was like in 1970, a year later.
Yeah, I think it was June of 70.
Yeah.
It's like 13 months later. And you know, I was lucky enough to be able to talk to Vernon Brewer, who was the promotions manager at Track Records. And Track had some, you know, that was their thing. They were like one of the first, or maybe the first, really successful indie label in the UK. And they were so innovative and creative and just didn't necessarily care about convention. You know, when the Who put out the Magic Bus single, they rented, you know, Vernon's like, okay, I need to get a bus. So he got an old bus, like an antique London bus. He's like, but it's supposed to be a magic bus. So he got a baby elephant, and he said, a lion. He goes, somewhere I've got a picture of me standing next to this lion. He's like, God knows what I was thinking. They had a lion on this bus and these like mini skirt clad models, and they're driving it around London with, you know, blasting the new Who single with, I guess, the members of the Who on there too. So they were pretty nutty when it came to the creative. And then, you know, they had Hendrix and the Electric Ladyland single, which had like naked women on it. And apparently they shut down Piccadilly Circus, traffic in Piccadilly Circus, by putting images of the album cover and some scantily clad models in a shop front in Piccadilly Circus. So they knew how to get people's attention. And Vernon, for the Accidents single, he was like, you know, he said it was really challenging because he said pretty much a lot of the air had gone out of the balloon at that point. Like, they had this enormous boost back in the summer of 69, but by the summer of 70, there had been no news about Thunderclap Newman pretty much at all in that intervening year. No new records. So he's like, a lot of people had forgotten about him by then. So it was really difficult for him to promote it. But he thought, okay, accidents. What do I think of when I think of an accident? And he said, I think of those St. Bernard dogs, you know, and they call them St. Bernards in England. And the rescue dogs in the Alps that had the brandy barrel around their necks. And he's like, you know, they'd go out and rescue hikers and skiers out in the snow. So he's like, I put an ad in the papers in England and asked anybody that had a St. Bernard to, you know, if they're interested to gather in London on this certain date. Or he said like 50 St. Bernards. And there's a picture, if you Google, if you look for it online, you can find it. It's of a BBC DJ, and I can't remember what his name was. And there's all these St. Bernards sitting around, and apparently they paraded them from Track's offices to the BBC offices. But then I found a bigger version of the photo, and in the background you can see Andy and Speedy and Jimmy standing there too. So it's really cool. But yeah, they were super creative, but the schedule of releases, you know, was just that gap was too great. And Accidents, I think so. Accidents on the album is almost 10 minutes long. And Pete today calls it a masterpiece. The one that's on the album is a masterpiece. Obviously, that's far too long for a single. When you listen to the single, it's got like the opening verse, at least, is sung by Jimmy.
Yeah.
And I think it's really cool. It's very creatively done. It's significantly different from the build up and the kind of more storytelling aspects of that longer one. But man, it's really good and really catchy. And it's too bad it didn't catch on. And then The Reason came out pretty quickly, I think that was the next single after Accidents. And that too is a great single. Really catchy. Didn't catch on. Just it's like, that, like I said, that the air was all gone out of the balloon. It's their opportunity had passed for whatever reason.
I think I know. I can't remember what interview it was with Andy. It might have been a radio or TV interview or something where he mentioned if Thunderclap Newman didn't get a number one right away, if they gradually built up to it, I think they would have their lifespan as a band would have lasted a little bit longer.
Yeah,
Which I always thought was an interesting way to look at it. Like
yeah,
you just it's just amazing to me how they went to number one so quickly and nobody was prepared for it.
exact. That's what I was going to say. They weren't ready. They just weren't. It caught everybody by surprise. And I remember Andy saying at one point that Track was really a one band label, so all the attention was on the Who, especially by the time the album had come out. Jimi Hendrix had died too, just a couple of weeks earlier.
Oh yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah, because I think the album was released like either the day after. I talk about it in the books, either the day after or the same day as Hendrix's funeral. But Andy felt like, none of the attention was on Thunderclap Newman, really. Maybe just for a little tiny period there when it was kind of forced on Thunderclap Newman because of the number one. But he was just like, it was all on the Who. And then the thing, Richard Barnes pointed this out: the Who's management, when we get into the late 70s and late 70 and early 71, they're starting to have addiction issues. And Richard Barnes was like, usually the managers are watching over the band members to make sure they're not getting addicted to drugs. But he said with the Who, it was the other way around. So, all of a sudden you're early 71, Kit Lambert's, he's abusing heroin, and Chris Stamp's got his own addiction issues at that point. So the management, when they were there, were paying attention to the Who, and often at that point they weren't paying attention to anything. So yeah, they blew up. They weren't ready. They were pushed out on the road, and it didn't. They were unprepared in so many different ways, and it's very unfortunate.
Which to that point makes their sort of, I don't know if revival is the best word to describe their reformation in 70, 71, but
Yeah,
that live lineup with Roger and Ronnie was pretty tight.
that's something that I didn't really become aware of until I heard some of the recordings from Castile there in the Netherlands.
Yeah.
It's quite something. They were, Jimmy was just blazing. Yeah, they were a good band. They were, they'd finally because I guess they had learned that, in that the tour, July and August of 69. It's like when Speedy recruited that new rhythm section, it seemed like they must have been a lot more disciplined with rehearsing and getting down a good live act, and it shows there, yeah, in the Castile those recordings.
Yeah, I wish they would have done well, Roger told me that they performed Accidents every night on that tour, but for some reason the Castile performance doesn't include Accidents.
That is too bad.
That would have been, because that's my favorite Thunderclap Newman song, the
Yeah,
album version. So hearing a live version of that, oh my gosh,
Yeah,
that's one of the holy grails, I think, for me.
yeah. That's probably my favorite too. I really like, another favorite for me, and I don't understand why it's not on the album, is I See It All.
Yeah, that's a great one too.
I think Jimmy's voice, first of all, it surprised me when I heard his voice coming out of a slight small guy. It's a little deeper and more kind of full, like forceful than I thought it would be. And he sounds a lot more English than I thought he would sound. Um, but also I just think it's a great change up from Speedy's voice and Andy's voice. I would have thought. So I don't understand really why that didn't make the cut, but there it is.
Well, I think they were initially at that point thinking about doing another album, and in my head, Thunderclap had canon. I think Jimmy would have had at least one or two songs on a potential second Thunderclap record,
Yeah, yeah,
but
yeah.
yeah,
They were definitely talking about a second album. They were, they had those quotes that I use in the book where Pete is referring to, another album, and I think some of the other guys are quoted as referring to. I think Speedy does too. But so they definitely had plans to, for the future. And after the fact, there's stuff from Andy and Speedy when they're talking to the media later on about regrets of not having done that.
yeah,
You know, the track. Yeah, when you get into the early '70s, as the '70s progressed, track was starting to, because of those issues with Kit Lambert and Chris Stamp, track was starting to, and then when you get like '73, '74, now you're starting to get into the issues where, with financial mismanagement and some animosity between the Who and their management that led to legal disputes and management being replaced and all that. Track was just kind of on the decline, and the focus went away from, Speedy started a solo career, but then he left Track. Andy recorded an album, released it on Track, but then he was gone. It was like the status of Track through that whole thing didn't do anybody any favors either.
So I'm curious if you in your research came across this article. I think it was from the Detroit Free Press, where it was an interview with Pete before the album came out, and they were talking about ideas for the record. And Pete said something like, "Oh, we're gonna recruit like members
Yeah,
of the Small Faces and Jeff Beck or whoever to
yeah, yeah, yeah.
record the album." I'm just curious to get your thoughts on that, because when I
Yeah,
read that, I was like, "Whoa, that would have been amazing."
yeah. I think it was when he was in the U.S. for Woodstock, and then he did like a couple radio interviews, and I think during that same visit was when he talked to whatever it was, Atlantic, or he talked to a U.S. label about distribution of Thunderclap over here too. But yeah, he mentions all these, like, I think Ronnie Wood
Yeah,
and maybe Jeff Beck and the guys from the Small Faces, about having like this all-star lineup of like musicians playing with Thunderclap. And I'm like, man, what happened to that? And are there any recordings that didn't surface or whatever? And so it's really cool that they were at least throwing ideas around like that. I don't know if anything ever uh, happened, if there were any sessions, and of course we haven't found any evidence of that. But it's cool, some of the creative stuff they did. Like I was talking to Richard Stanley, who was a filmmaker, who is a filmmaker, and he was friends with Pete, another art school guy, another really creative guy. And Pete was very much into film during this period, when Thunderclap came together. And Richard Stanley was called in to try and help push the band a little bit creatively. And they had him sit down as like a Rorschach test, where they hold up those ink blots or whatever, and you're supposed to interpret what that means, and it says, it makes some kind of statement about how you are, where you're at psychologically. Richard said, we're in Pete's little tiny studio, and Andy is sitting at this upright piano, and Jimmy's got an acoustic guitar, and he said Speedy's like patting out a rhythm on his thighs, just sitting in a chair. And Richard Stanley would put a photograph of a crocodile in front of Andy and just basically like play what comes to mind based on this picture, or like a coconut or whatever, like all these different images. So they were definitely, there were some out of the box ideas, you know, that were thrown around. But yeah, it's really cool. And yeah, back to the All-Star thing, I have no idea if it appears to never have got past the idea phase.
Yeah. So one would say that your journey has been amazing.
Yeah, right.
Um, so do you have any like throughout your research or writing the book, do you have any like favorite little moments like that have happened along the way, like whether it be in your travels or interviewing people that come to mind, like
Oh, definitely. I mean, first of all, you know, like I said at the beginning, Pete is my number one musical hero. Quadrophenia is my all-time favorite album, um, far above anything else. Pete's creative work has had the most profound influence on me of anything. So Pete's involvement in this project, his input, I'm gonna just read one little. This he sent me an email with this quote early on. Thunderclap Newman were my invention and my most enjoyable recording session, better than any Who session for me. That is a seriously mind-blowing statement to me just there. And then he said, as far as I know, my only genuine number one in any role at all in the business. I still publish Speedy's Thunderclap songs, and I'm immensely proud of them and my part in their genesis. That blew me away. And I thought that's just an amazing thing to go in the book. And then the fact that Pete wrote the foreword to this book is hugely meaningful to me. Not just because of the added information, there we go, but also just the credibility and that endorsement, you know, that implicit endorsement is hugely meaningful. But other stuff along the way. So again, I said, you know, Richard Barnes wrote that Maximum R&B book that I read when I was a teenager, and it's been a part of Pete and the Who's story for decades. He wrote the Maximum R&B book. He wrote a book called Mods, which was really good. He wrote one in the mid '70s about the making of Tommy, the film, the Ken Russell film. And I had all of those, and I devoured them. I got in touch with him, emailed back and forth a little bit, went to London in March, April of 22 or 3, I can't remember. I went to London 2 years in a row for research for this book. Walked around Speedy and Andy's and Jimmy's, you know, where they used to live, their old neighborhoods and things. Went to where Jim Marshall's music was, where Speedy used to, or music shop used to be, or Speedy used to hang out. Go to a bunch of locations, talk to some family members, things like that. Richard Barnes met me in Ealing one day, and we spent about 5 hours walking around Ealing. We went into Ealing Arts, it's still a college, Ealing Art School. We walked down Sunnyside Road, and he showed me the flat that him and Pete used to live in, and this window that they used to climb through if they forgot their key. And we walked through Ealing Common, and Richard Barnes was like, yeah, when I used to live at Pete's house, in Pete's parents' house, before we got our own place, he said, we used to walk through Ealing Common on the way to art school, and there used to be a place called the Bijou Guest House. And he said, that's where that whole thing, you know, Pete's nickname or pen name or whatever, pseudonym for the Thunderclap Newman sessions was Bijou Drains. There's this place called the Bijou Guest House. We're walking along Ealing Common. I'm like, there it is. It's still there. And we were both just blown away. And we went to, you know, we went and ate lunch and sat in a pub and talked, and went checked out the old Ealing Club. That, I mean, it was just phenomenal experience for me, not only as a gathering stories as a writer of this book, but just as a fan. It was just mind blowing. The stories that Barney has in this book are amazing. Most of them I got from a telephone interview that I did with him beforehand, but meeting him and getting a tour of Ealing was just priceless. The other cool thing that was totally unexpected, was Chris Thomas. I mean, Chris Thomas is a legendary producer, and I'm probably the only person that's ever asked him about Speedy Keen and his involvement with Speedy, because I'm sure he gets asked a lot of questions about the Sex Pistols and the Pretenders and NXS and Roxy Music and all that stuff, but and Pink Floyd and the Beatles. But yeah, it just so happens that Chris Thomas's band was the band that Speedy joined right after he got back from Italy in 1966, and they recorded a song by Pete, Pete had just written, called "Run Run Run." So Chris Thomas was there when Pete and Speedy first did something together, and it may have been the first time they met. It probably was. That meeting led to Chris Thomas deciding, well, eventually it led to Chris Thomas deciding he didn't want to be in a band anymore. And he said that, among a couple of other things, which I talk about in the prologue, led to him writing a letter to George Martin and starting his career as a producer. It led to Speedy. It started the connection between Speedy and Pete. So it changed Speedy's life. There's a quote that I use where he said, Pete switched on the light for me that day. And it also, of course, changed the arc of Pete's career. And looking back, it's his favorite thing that he did in a studio. So it was just this hugely critical moment in the history of these guys. And Chris Thomas just happened to be there. I didn't know that. I wanted to hear the story. I knew he was involved in that early thing, but I didn't know it was that profound, you know. And he has a really funny story about you know, what happened when Speedy all of a sudden disappeared and became Pete's driver too. And then all of a sudden, you know, Chris Thomas turns up in other places. He worked with Jimmy later on in the 70s, because he was the guy that did he produced the sound on the rock show film. So he worked with Jimmy on overdubs and things, and hung out with him and went to a Beach Boys concert and stuff. But all of that, you know, those were my favorite things. Obviously, not to go on too long if I haven't already, Speedy's daughter letting me go through his you know, memoir / diary, you know, the stuff that he wrote out about his life in the early, I think it was the early 80s when he got down to it. But some of the stories about his childhood and about his dad and about taking his driving test and about them having a little party out in the street when the Queen, you know, on Coronation Day, talking to Andy's brother, his older brother, in a pub in Richmond, about, you know, when Andy got his first pay packet, he ironed the pound notes to make them nice and crisp and smooth and things, and him destroying the family heirloom piano because he hit it too, you know, he played too hard. All of those little things, when you add them all up, it's just phenomenal. You know, for somebody that's trying to learn and piece all this together, having those little stories where you can actually just visualize, and it helps illustrate these people's characters and personalities. I've been really, really lucky, and those were my favorite moments.
Yeah, Trisha's amazing, isn't she? She's such a genuine, sweet person.
Yeah, and I see, you know, I know obviously never met Speedy. He died more than 20 years ago now. But I can see she's Speedy's daughter. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
You can see some of those similar characteristics. Yeah, it's really, really cool to be able to get involved with family members. And of course, on the Jimmy side, I wasn't in touch with any family members, but you know, this and your input, you know, I was able to talk to you know, some of Jimmy's bandmates and good friends, and I got some really good information from them, and of course from Pete as well, and from Chris Thomas, who hung out with him a little bit. Mm-hmm. But you did a phenomenal amount of research and were well ahead of me on that side of it. So your input on the, you know, particularly on the Jimmy thing, has been extremely valuable and made the story that much better. You know?
I appreciate it. For me, it was amazing to hear, like, a lot of the people that you were able to talk to? Because like I had no idea about some of these people. Like you talk to like track records employees and you name it. It was just amazing for me to hear like who you got in touch with and stuff. And it shows your passion and your commitment to making or and your commitment to telling the Thunderclap Newman story the right way. And it's just an absolutely incredible book.
I
So
appreciate it. Yeah, I had a head start, with the Pete book. I talked to some guys. I talked to Dana Whiffen, who was the office boy is what they called him at Track Records. He was a teenager when he worked at Track. I talked to him again for this book because he remembered when Andy came over and spent the night at his house, and Andy woke up and all of Dana's cats were sleeping on top of Andy, and he remembered Andy pulling up with his old GPO van that was kitted out with all of his instruments in the back and stuff like that, and like him getting this enormous saxophone out and playing it in the middle of his street, and that kind of stuff. So I was in touch with some of those guys already, and I was just able to kind of, when you talk, I'm sure it worked this way, and at some points in your Jimmy book where you talk to one person, they're like, "Have you talked to this other one? I can put you in touch with him," and then you start kind of networking from there. Or conversely, you run into this situation where you're talking to somebody and they're like, and I mentioned somebody else and they're like, "Oh, how's he doing? I haven't talked to him since 1970." And you
yeah,
actually connect to people that haven't talked in decades. So it's the coolest thing. It's just the craziest thing. If you have a passion for it, and you're willing to listen and ask questions and do some detective work, it winds up just being a whole crazy, amazing journey. Just like you said, it's
yeah,
crazy.
yeah. I know for me, part of the most the thing that meant the most to me besides getting to tell Jimmy's story um was just connecting so many people who knew Jimmy at certain points back in the day, but like they didn't know each other. So
Yeah,
being connected through this one little Scottish guy is like all these years later is just incredible. um
yeah,
and just shows what like the impact that Jimmy had and Thunderclap Newman had on so many people,
yeah,
which is just absolutely incredible.
yeah. And here we are, 50 plus years later. We're left with this one-off album that is just, there's nothing like it. Um, and a handful of singles that didn't, or, tracks on singles that did B-sides and things that didn't make the album, but and it's just really cool to be able to kind of fill out some of the backstories and what these guys, their lives before Thunderclap, and how all three of them were so incredibly different, and then what each of them got up to after Thunderclap. Like they all three, it's fascinating what they got up to. I mean, Jimmy was certainly the most written about and famous of the three afterwards, because famously he was with Wings during their
Mhm.
peak, right?
Yeah.
Um, but Andy and Speedy wound up. I did a couple solo albums, and he wound up, and Speedy, like Richard Barnes told me, was a hippie. you know, he wound up producing Motorhead, which I was like, how do you get from hippie to Motorhead? But at that point, his nickname Speedy brought on a whole other. He's actually doing speed.
Yeah.
And Andy went on to, Andy was an electrician, uh, but he wound up, so he fell back into that, doing like freelance electric work and things, and living in this like housing cooperative type squat thing in Clapham, where he rigged the houses up with like an alarm, because sometimes bikers would come through and want to beat him up. So he had like an alarm system set up that he devised. But he also did work with, he did a solo album. He did work with Roger Spear, who was from the Bonzo Dog Doodah band. He did this like underground comedy thing with Bob Flagg and David Bowie's wife. And, just all these crazy stories. It's just fascinating. Of course, later on, Andy, there was a couple of reconstituted versions of Thunderclap Newman. So that Pete actually got involved with at the very, very end, right before Andy passed away. There was talk of another album with Pete's involvement. So it's a crazy story. It's fascinating. I think it's I loved it. I loved being able to do it.
And I appreciate the opportunity getting to interview you today, because it's kind of come full circle for us, having met what 2013 at the Who concert in Louisville.
That's right. I forgot
Yeah.
about that. Yeah. So we met there, and I had my sons with me. That was the first time they met Pete. They've been the only time they met Pete. But yeah, that's right. You were sitting there, and that's how we connected, wasn't it?
Yeah.
You'd already started work on your book about Jimmy, and yeah, I was there because I'd done the book about Pete a few years before that. Yeah, we got to hang out with him before the show in Louisville. Yeah, pretty amazing.
Yeah, pretty crazy. Okay, so Hollywood Dream is out on October 1st, and here's the book. And can you just tell people where they can purchase it?
Yeah, so there's going to be Third Man Books, based in Nashville, is the publisher. And we were just talking before we kind of hit the record button about how the Thunderclap Newman Story is it's a one-off. It's a completely unique and eclectic type story, and Third Man's a similar setup. So I think it's a perfect fit. Third Man is Jack White's company, Third Man Records and Third Man Books. They don't publish many books, and they do a very diverse kind of listing, poetry. They just did one. They just released one called Dynamite Nashville, which is about civil rights cases in Nashville. So they're all across the board with their content, and I think it's a perfect place for this book. An announcement is going to go out on August 30th on thewho.com and on the Third Man website, which will give details of the standard, the paperback edition, and also a limited edition that's got some really cool content, and it'll be a hardcover as well. Announcement with all that information and a pre-order links for that stuff will come out on August the 30th on those sites. Yeah, US release date is October 1st for the standard edition. UK publication date is November 14th, and then the limited edition will be available sometime in November. So yeah, really excited to be able to share all those details with everybody, and for everybody to get to read this thing. I think it's a pretty amazing story.
It definitely is, and you did an absolutely phenomenal job. And I can't thank you enough for bringing Thunderclap's story and weaving it into such a wonderful and incredible book. So, from a big Thunderclap Newman fan, I thank you.
Well, thank you, Paul, and thank you for that compliment. And I will tell you, you set the bar very high with your Jimmy book.
I appreciate it.
That was in the back of my mind when I was working on this thing. So yeah, I think like we talked about, these books are siblings. So yeah, two very underreported, undertold, if told at all, stories. So really, really cool to see them out in the public.
For sure. Well, Mark, thank you for joining me today. And people can find you on social media as well to promote the book and stuff. Do you have anything else lined up?
Yeah, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, or X, or whatever the heck it's called. So yeah, I'll put it all out there. But yeah, thewho.com is going to have the information too, and also Third Man. So cool. We're doing our best to get the word out. But thanks. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about it, and to nerd out about Thunderclap with somebody that knows a lot about them like you.
Yeah, sure.
So
awesome.
All right, thanks.
Thank you.